Hello and welcome to Frampton Unplugged. This is episode 5 now. You'll notice that we're in a slightly different setting, slightly warmer climes. Today's episode is all around gender equality and specifically why I believe that we need more men involved in the conversation. So last week was International Women's Day and there were some fantastic kind of outpourings of the need for more change and some fantastic stories being told. But I decided that I'd film this after International Women's Day because I think we need to keep the conversation going. It's not just about one day in the year or even one event. There are many events around gender equality, but in order to keep the momentum moving, given it's taken us 100 years since the suffragettes to get to where we are today, it's important the message keeps going. So last week on International Women's Day, I was delighted to be selected amongst 30 men, 30 leaders who've been identified as agents of change within gender equality. It's not why I do it, but it's nice to be recognised. And more importantly, it's good to be recognised that there are men that are really banging the drum for gender equality and trying to drive kind of more gender equality within the workplace. So on that list were people like Mark Alera from Orange EE, the CEO there, and also the CEO of Diageo. So great to see some kind of really kind of big business leaders who are making change in their business and actually actively driving gender equality. So you may wonder why I'm so vocal about this topic. So I thought I'd maybe just share a little bit about my story and my background that will hopefully bring that to life. So I was lucky enough to grow up with kind of equal role models. Both my mum and my dad were equally successful. Both were actually at the heads of their schools, and I was taught at a very early age to think about the term head teacher rather than headmaster, because both my mum and my dad were doing the same role at different schools at the same time. So I was very fortunate to have role models of both kind of mums and dads at home, but also leaders in their work environments that were identical, exactly the same. So I didn't look at my dad being the one that went out and was the breadwinner. I had equal role models for kind of both work and home. So that probably gives you a sense. I'm also fortunate enough to have two daughters, one of whom is just entering adulthood at the age of 16. And it's very important to me to think about the world that they grow up in. I also have two sons, and I'm really keen that my daughters have exactly the same opportunities that my sons do. In a world I grew up in, I think it was very true that boys and men had better opportunities. Most of the role models that I looked to when I was young as leadership, or kind of whether they were footballers or they were kind of in some role in business, the vast majority of them were men. Unfortunately, today that's changed. I mean, there are a lot more successful female role models, not nearly enough. And I think in the last year, 18 months, we've had a lot of progress there. But if you were to go and search on Google today for the term leadership, I guarantee you that what you'll find there is predominantly images of men. Whether they be images, kind of stock photos, animated kind of images of men, or they be real men, that's what you'll find. And it's important that we change that so that my daughters, your daughters, girls growing up everywhere see that they can do exactly what their brothers are doing, and they don't have to kind of select a role that is more akin to them being a girl versus being a boy. Equally, in my experience from being at work over the last 20 years, I've had as many kind of inspirational women that I've worked with as I have men. And in fact, women bring a really unique kind of value to the workplace. They bring empathy, which is something that men often lack. So they bring emotional intelligence, and the World Economic Forum talked about that being one of the key 5 values that will help this kind of fourth industrial revolution. But they also bring an ability to listen better. They bring the ability to think about the welfare of staff and of talent. And in a world that we're moving into, where machines and robots and AI will predominantly kind of drive a lot of business, then it's really important that we have those kind of values of EQ and empathy in the workplace. So why do we need more men involved in this conversation? I mean, it feels like a daft question to ask, but I think it's an important one to ask because clearly as women as a movement have started to think about how they drive change faster, and I've said it already, but it's taken 100 years since the suffragettes and not enough has changed. We've started to see kind of collectives of women who are banging the drum for change, which I absolutely kind of applaud and think is good. But there is a danger that we recreate the essence of what those boys' clubs used to be, where it was all about one gender, and the other gender was not allowed in. It was not accessible to them. And I think it's really important that whilst there are kind of collectives for both men and women to spend time with each other, supporting each other, talking about each other's challenges, we also need more opportunities where men and women come together and they collaborate and they talk about how, particularly in this particular sense, how they can together drive more change. Too many of the cliques or the collectives that we have in work environments are gender specific, whether that be the football club that the boys join or whether it be poetry club or whatever it be, that has a tendency to kind of skew one way or another in terms of gender. So I'm a big proponent of the fact that we need more examples and more kind of opportunities for men and women to come together, to talk together, to listen to each other, and to have the right types of conversation. But of course, post Me Too at the end of last year, we're in a different place right now, a much better place, a place where there is accelerated momentum, but I think also a place where a lot of men feel kind of a little concerned about putting their head above the parapet on this topic. They don't want to be kind of picked on or kind of called out for saying the wrong thing, even if actually they are a good role model for gender equality. And it's therefore for that reason that I think we need to try and find a way for men and women to come together, to make it accessible for men to join these conversations, because where they do, I think there's evidence increasingly kind of coming that it actually starts to drive more positive change. So you can't kind of picture that every man is actually a predator. I think that's an unfair kind of thing to do, or that all banter that men have is kind of abuse. However, it's important that men do recognise, and men are sometimes kind of lacking in emotional intelligence and awareness of what's going on around them. It's important that they think about how other people perceive some of the words they may use, some of the things they may talk about. So my kind of recommendation to men will be to think very carefully about that, and to think about the language and the tone of what you talk about, and think about the audience that is in front of you. But also we need to kind of think about how it's more kind of acceptable for these conversations to happen without there being this kind of innate concern or kind of anxiety that something bad is going to happen. If we can't get more men to join the conversation because they feel anxious or they feel kind of frightened about joining it, then I think that is a bad thing for driving a more inclusive culture. So because the societies that we've grown up in, the cultures that we've grown up in as men have normalised certain behaviour, I think it's fairly kind of accepted that all men will have said or done something inappropriate at some point. And I think it's the wrong thing for men to look at that and think, I can't be the right kind of role model. For me, it's what you do from today onwards. It's what you do tomorrow. It's the role model that you create for your children, whether they be kind of a boy or a girl. And it's the role model that you create in your own business for driving change and making it kind of as acceptable for a woman to be in a leadership position as a man, to make it as easy for a woman returning from maternity leave to be able to take on a bigger job should she want to, as a man that stayed at work or a father that stayed at work, because even today we have stereotypes where predominantly it's the mum that goes and looks after the child, whereas the father stays at home. I've been fortunate enough to spend more time with my fourth child, Jack, in the last year, because I haven't been working full on, and it's really given me kind of a view of the importance of kind of the father role model that should exist both at home but also in the workplace. I wrote a blog on this recently, which I'll share in the kind of commentary under this video in YouTube. But it's important for me that more men talk about being dads and talk about why it's important to be a dad and how that kind of role model that they play at home is something that transports to work. I think we've gone past the days where work and home were two separate places. Increasingly they are merged and they're fused together. So men and women need to be more comfortable between the identity they have between the two. Okay, so the last element that I wanted to talk about was actually what can men do, right? Hopefully there are quite a few men watching this, and I really hope there are more women, because to date most of my videos have attracted a male audience, and it's not intended that way, but the fact that they've been about leadership and they've been about the future of things, I don't know whether that has attracted a certain kind of audience, but I hope this video will kind of attract a slightly kind of more diverse audience. So what I'm going to share is predominantly summed up in a fantastic study from Murray Edwards College. It is a college in Cambridge that did a report talking to a kind of variety of male leaders about how they would go about kind of collaborating with women to drive change in the workplace. And the things that came out of it, I think, are things that everyone can take on board. The first is that as a man, you need to have more conversations with the women. You need to spend the time listening and asking questions so that you can learn about what the issues may be and listen to them and take them on board. Secondly, is a point around intervention. There will always be kind of banter, or there'll be gender inequality in the workplace. And it's important that kind of male leaders actually call that out and they do something to point at it and to demonstrate that it is unacceptable. Thirdly is actually thinking about how, as I talked about earlier, you create opportunities for men and women. You create communities where there are more conversations or more initiatives that are more diverse. Most kind of initiatives and projects that exist in a workplace still today are dominated by men versus women. And that's a default of the amount of females that are in leadership. But think about how you can get more equality for any project or any kind of team that you're putting together. In the same way that there's a big kind of push for gender equality on panels, we need the same thing happening within business for any of the initiatives that are being driven. And lastly, speak about the benefits for men. This is a thing that the Murray Edwards study focused on specifically. If men are going to join this conversation, then it's important that men see that there's a benefit for them as well as a benefit for the kind of women that they're helping. And of course, it talks about the fact that a more equal, diverse kind of workplace is one that's more productive, that drives better results, which is a thing that I think any man can kind of engage with. But more importantly, there are some kind of more emotional kind of benefits here that Murray Edwards points out that I think are important to talk about. Men are often kind of thought about as the provider. There's a lot of pressure on, or at least legacy pressure on, the man to be the one that goes and kind of earns the crust. And if there is a more equal kind of workplace, then that starts to dissipate a little, and the pressure that exists on men, the stress that men have to be a certain way, not to cry, not to show their emotions, to man up, all of those things. Hopefully, as there is a more equal, diverse workforce, those things start to kind of reduce. And that should mean that men have healthier kind of work lifestyles. They are kind of less stressed in the workplace. It also, Murray Edwards College would argue, helps you be a better father and a better husband because you're more in touch with how you should be both at work and at home, and you're able to play that role model between the two without the tension of, at work I must be this type of individual, and at home I will kind of let my guard down. I will be the dad that I want to be. So hopefully that demonstrates that there are some real kind of tangible benefits for men, and there are some tangible things that men can do differently. I think it's also worth thinking about the world ahead of us that is going to be, by 2020, 50% millennial. That group thinks very differently about gender. It's a much more fluid thing for them. And therefore, it's important that any leader kind of stepping into kind of managing an organisation with that generation is able to also kind of think about how gender becomes more fluid. How gender, how race, how every aspect of what makes up someone's identity is more fluid. And this is not just about kind of gender, creating the right inclusive cultures, allowing everybody to bring their whole selves to work, whether they are kind of a certain race, whether they're from a certain background, whether they have a certain sexual persuasion, or whether they are male or female. All of those things are important. So this video was designed to do two things, I guess. One was to hopefully remove some of the anxieties that men may have about joining this conversation. And secondly, to give you some thoughts about how you can lean in. It's interesting, that term, because that term has been very much defined by Sheryl Sandberg in her book, and has therefore become a term that's been owned as a feminine kind of term. But I think it should equally be one that men can kind of adapt to and can kind of reach out to. We need more men to lean into this conversation, and it's dangerous when we create movements that are either feminine or masculine. We need movements that actually are around the collaboration between the two genders. And I also think that any man listening to this, whether you're kind of 2 years into the business, you're 20 years into the business, or 40 years into into the business. You can be a role model for what masculinity looks like today. It doesn't need to be what it looked like yesterday. You don't need to be the kind of strong, kind of man up character that never shows their emotions. You can show vulnerability, you can show your emotions, and you can get more in touch with some of the feminine values like empathy and listening, kind of welfare, and that will make you a better leader. So, thanks very much for tuning in again. Delighted to have you here as always. I hope that's been interesting. I'm going to put some of the content that I've talked about down in the comments as usual. If you like the video, then please do make sure you like it and share it. And we'll be back fairly shortly with episode 6. See you soon.